All right, welcome in. Today we're going to talk about special purpose acquisition companies, otherwise known as SPACs, what they are, and the mechanics of how they work. So what is a SPAC? A SPAC is just a shell company that's set up and taken public with the intent of investing in a private company to take that private company public. It can be a quick, cheap, easy way to take that private company public. Here's a little information on the SPACs. A SPAC is made up of units. That's usually one common stock share plus one or two warrants, and those warrants are redeemable after the acquisition takes place. When these units are formed, the SPAC money is put into a trust account. The SPAC has 2 years to make an acquisition, or it's dissolved and the money goes back to the investors. Generally, a SPAC is going to be sponsored by a well-known, well-heeled investor, and it's also generally exempt from Rule 419 of the SEC. This is kind of an important point because SPACs kind of get lumped in with blank check companies, which many of them have a bad reputation, but SPACs actually are mostly exempt from Rule 419. What Rule 419 is that it makes these blank check companies that are basically set up this way where they raise the money first to then go purchase a company and take it public. The Rule 419 says that money has to go in escrow, not into a trust account, and the units are not allowed to be traded prior to that acquisition, whereas a SPAC, it can trade right at the IPO. So the SPAC has the IPO. It's a shell company made up of these units. Each unit is a share of common stock and a warrant or two, and then it can be done. An additional thing kind of on the blank check, and you'll see why in a second, but another difference on the blank check is that the voting is a little different. The SPAC sponsor, this generally well-heeled, well-known investor, can take the company private, can do the reverse merger, which we'll talk about in a second, and does not need a shareholder vote. So these unit holders do not necessarily get to vote, whereas in the blank check company, under Rule 419, they would have a vote. So in this case, it's just the board of directors of this private company that would have the vote, the shareholders of the private company that would have a vote as to whether they want to be purchased by the SPAC at the given terms. The SPAC operator, this well-known, well-heeled investor, does not need the vote, and we'll show why that is in a second. And it has to do with the mechanics of the transaction. So how does this work? It works using something called reverse triangular merger. Wow, that's a mouthful, but it's pretty simple. So we'll show you how it works. Generally, in a traditional scenario, when a company goes public, you've got your private company X. Your private company wants to go public, goes through the IPO process, which is a big, dog and pony show. They have to file an S1. Oh, and by the way, I guess I should say, in the SPACs, they do not file an S1. Many of them, even after the acquisition, run on an S3, which is less of a form, but that is being challenged. But many of the SPACs were running with an S3, just FYI. Anyway, so generally, you're going to be set up. You have your S1, that's your information for investors. You go through the IPO process, and some percentage of that company gets offered to the public. This public is the money that's used to purchase this piece of the company. So you settle on some numbers, say 10 billion, whatever the market capitalization is, and then 20% of that gets offered to the public. The rest is owned by, the founders, the venture funds, whatever, banks, whatever. So that goes through the IPO process. They settle on this amount through the $7 million of fees that are paid to Goldman. That's their big thing, is to settle on that and force the company to offer a green shoe while this is working. Anyway, so basically they go through this IPO process. It's very costly. Like I said, $7 million to Goldman for you to pay for a green shoe. And then, this amount, this percentage gets offered. The public is the money. The public buys that amount. And then now this entire company is in the public hemisphere. It's just made up of these shareholders and the public now. But the fact that the public now is involved and it's on an exchange. It's now traded on an exchange, and this whole company has effectively moved to the public market, even though there was only maybe 20% of the company sold. So the SPAC is very similar. It's just instead of the public, now you've got the SPAC who's the money. Now, again, we talked about the mechanics of it, the reverse triangular merger, and that's what this is right here. So you've got your private company X, like we talked about. Let's say that they settle on 10 billion internally, or the SPAC and the private company settle on that. Now, remember, this SPAC is publicly traded, so it's out here. So again, it's kind of effectively acting as the public money, but it's a specific piece of public money. So you've got this SPAC out here. The triangular part, and the part that gets away from the voting rights of the SPAC unit holders, is that this SPAC creates a subsidiary, and the subsidiary actually buys this company. So say the SPAC set up with $2 billion, it creates a subsidiary. The subsidiary actually ends up having that money. That same, let's say 20%, gets purchased now by this subsidiary. So that functions as that public money. The subsidiary now merges with this company. Now this whole 10 billion for this price of 2 billion, this whole 10 billion has come over. It's part of this subsidiary. It's part of the SPAC. And now the SPAC changes to be this private company. It changes its ticker symbol, and it's that company. Again, it's not magic. It changes just as when, the mechanics of when this public money gets involved here, there's a mixing of everything. Even though these people remain the owners, it's now on the public exchange, and it's the same with a SPAC. So the SPAC, there's a mixing of this money now, even though there's still potentially these owners, family and to some degree venture people, although they're going to be using it as a liquidity event. So you've got the family and the venture people. They're still owners of the 8 billion, at least initially, but now they've got a company, they're issued shares, and there you go. So thank you for listening, and please like and subscribe. We'd love to have you. We're just building this catalog, so we hope that you'll be an early subscriber. And again, we love feedback. We love comments. We've already had some really fabulous discussions in the comments, so go for it. And there we go.